This presentation is for Chapter 8, Flexible Budgets and Standard Cost Systems. In Learning Objective 4, we will learn to compute the standard cost variances for manufacturing overhead. In this section, we will use the terms manufacturing overhead and overhead interchangeably. The total overhead variance is the difference between actual overhead cost and standard overhead allocated to production. Previously, we saw that Cheerful Colors had incurred $30,160 in variable overhead costs and $23,920 in fixed overhead costs. Therefore, total overhead costs incurred were $54,080. In a standard cost system, the manufacturing overhead is allocated to production by multiplying the standard overhead allocation rate by the standard quantity of the allocation base allowed for actual output. In a standard cost system, the standard overhead allocation rate replaces the predetermined overhead allocation rate that we used in previous chapters, but the concept is the same. It is a rate calculated during the budgeting process when other standards are determined. Let's begin by computing Cheerful Colors' standard, variable, and fixed overhead allocation rates. So Cheerful Colors allocates overhead based on direct labor hours. We saw in the static budget that Cheerful Colors expected that production would be 50,000 batches of crayons. At that level of production and using the direct labor efficiency standard of 0.25 direct labor hours per batch, Cheerful Colors expected to incur 12,500 direct labor hours. The standard overhead allocation rate is $5 per direct labor hour as calculated on this slide. Cheerful Colors used a $3 per direct labor hour rate to allocate variable overhead to batches and $2 per direct labor hour rate to allocate the fixed overhead to batches in 2025. Cheerful Colors will use a similar approach to analyze the variable overhead flexible budget variance as it did to analyze the direct materials and direct labor variances. Remember that direct material and direct labor are also variable costs, so the approach is similar. As we can see on this slide, variable overhead cost standard was $3 per direct labor hour. The variable overhead efficiency standard was 0.25 direct labor hour per batch of crayons. Therefore, the variable overhead standard cost per batch was 75 cents per batch. Actual amount of direct labor hours was 10,400 and actual cost of variable overhead was $30,160. So Cheerful Colors paid less than expected for variable overhead. The actual cost of variable overhead per hour was $2.90, which was calculated by taking the actual variable overhead of $30,160 and dividing it by the actual direct labor hours of 10,400. Using the formula, the variable overhead cost variance is $1,040 favorable. The $1,040 variable overhead cost variance is favorable because Cheerful Colors spent 10 cents less per hour than budgeted. Because variable overhead is allocated based on direct labor hours used, this variance is also favorable, as we saw the direct labor efficiency variance was favorable before. The standard quantity of direct labor hours that workers should have used to make 52,000 batches of crayons was 13,000 total direct labor hours, or 52,000 batches times 0.25 direct labor hours per batch. The 7,800 variable overhead efficiency variance is favorable because laborers actually worked 2,600 fewer hours than the flexible budget called for to produce 52,000 batches of crayons, and variable overhead is allocated based on direct labor hours. So this slide shows how Cheerful Colors divided the $8,840 favorable variable overhead flexible budget variance into its cost and efficiency components. The $8,840 favorable variable overhead variance indicates that variable overhead costs were less than expected. To manage Cheerful Colors' variable overhead costs, we need to get a little more insight. So Cheerful Colors incurred $1,040 less than anticipated in actual variable overhead costs for a favorable cost variance. Workers made 52,000 batches of crayons in 10,400 hours instead of the budgeted 13,000 hours for a favorable efficiency variance. Management may decide that the variable overhead cost variance is sufficiently small that it does not warrant investigation. However, management may want to investigate the variance further to determine whether the reduction in cost was controllable or whether the cost standard needs to be updated. The fixed production cost analyzed so far The three production costs analyzed so far were variable costs, so the analysis is similar for direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead. However, Cheerful Colors uses a slightly different approach to analyze the fixed overhead variances. Remember that fixed costs are not expected to change in total within the relevant range, but they do change per unit when there is a change in volume. To analyze fixed costs, we need three amounts: actual fixed overhead cost incurred, budgeted fixed overhead cost, and allocated fixed overhead cost. So keep in mind that the budgeted amount for fixed overhead is the same in both the static and the flexible budget because fixed costs are not expected to change in total when there is a change in volume. The fixed overhead cost variance measures the difference between actual fixed overhead and budgeted fixed overhead to determine the controllable portion of total fixed overhead variance. The $1,080 fixed overhead cost variance is favorable because Cheerful Colors actually spent less than budgeted for fixed overhead. Changes in volume do not affect fixed costs, therefore there is only a cost effect and not an efficiency effect in the fixed overhead flexible budget variance. The fixed overhead volume variance measures the difference between the budgeted fixed overhead and the amount of fixed overhead allocated to batches of crayons. Using the standard overhead allocation rate for fixed overhead that we previously calculated, fixed overhead should be allocated at $2 per direct labor hour, and each batch of crayons has an efficiency standard of 0.25 direct labor hours per batch. Therefore, the amount of fixed overhead allocated is $26,000. The 1,000 fixed overhead volume variance is favorable because Cheerful Colors produced more batches than budgeted and therefore allocated more overhead to crayon batches than the $25,000 budgeted fixed overhead amount. In other words, based on the standard for fixed overhead, Cheerful Colors has overallocated fixed overhead by $1,000. The fixed overhead volume variance is not a cost variance, it is a volume variance, and explains why fixed overhead is over or under allocated. So this graph shows the fixed overhead volume variance. The small blue triangle bordered by the lines represents budgeted fixed overhead, standard fixed overhead allocated, and standard direct labor hours represents the fixed overhead volume variance for this example. This exhibit summarizes the fixed overhead variances. To manage Cheerful Colors' fixed overhead costs, we need to get a little more insight. Cheerful Colors incurred $1,080 less than anticipated in fixed overhead costs for a favorable cost variance. Workers made 52,000 batches of crayons, which was 2,000 batches more than budgeted and resulted in a $1,000 favorable volume variance. Management may decide that the fixed overhead cost variance is sufficiently small and does not warrant investigation. However, management may want to investigate the variance further to determine whether the reduction in cost was controllable or whether the cost standard needs to be updated. And that is the conclusion of the presentation for Learning Objective 4.